All right, all right. Ah, all right then.
The town of Hollow Creek had always been a quiet place, where the most excitement came from a sudden rainstorm or a stray cow crossing the road. But there was one spot on the outskirts, where the trees grew unnaturally dense and the mist clung to the ground like a shroud. It was the kind of place that whispered to you, even when you weren't listening. That place was the old barn. For as long as anyone could remember, the barn had been the subject of hushed conversations and fearful glances. No one truly knew when it had become cursed, when it had gone from being a simple farming structure to something darker, something that sent a chill down your spine. But what was certain was that no one dared go near it. The stories were all the same: strange noises in the dead of night, animals acting in terror, and lights flickering inside when there was no electricity. The locals, afraid to speak too loudly, called it the Devil's Barn. Jake Harrison, a young cowboy known for his courage, had never been one to believe in ghost stories or superstitions. He'd heard the tales everyone had, but they didn't scare him. He'd grown up with more than his fair share of dangers: wild cattle, wild weather, and the roughest trails in the county. What could a barn, no matter how haunted, throw at him that he hadn't faced already? But when the news came that a horse had gone missing, and the last place it was seen was near that barn, Jake's curiosity got the better of him. Little did he know, this would be a journey into a darkness far deeper than any superstition. Something was waiting for him, just beyond those rotting barn doors. And it wasn't going to let him leave easily. The barn, which stood on the edge of Hollow Creek, had a history so tangled in whispers that even the oldest residents had trouble separating fact from myth. It wasn't always a place of fear. In its early days, it had been a thriving farmstead, owned by a man named Silas Carter. He was a recluse, but his farm was known for its healthy livestock and well-kept crops. To most, he seemed like just another hard-working farmer, albeit one who preferred the company of animals to people. But something began to change around the time the town's railroad tracks were built just a few miles away. A dark transformation overtook Silas. The once welcoming farmer became more withdrawn, his eyes hollow and his face gaunt. The barn, once a symbol of prosperity, began to take on an eerie aura. Locals who passed by reported seeing strange lights flickering from within its walls, and some swore they heard horses crying out at night, their anguished whinnies carried on the wind. But no one dared question Silas, who always kept to himself, rarely leaving his property. Then came the disappearances. It started with a few stray animals, a missing cow or two, but soon it was more than that. Children began to whisper that they had seen Silas's horses acting strangely, as if they were being forced into the barn by invisible hands. Those who were brave enough to venture close reported hearing heavy thuds, like the sound of something or someone being struck. The barn's doors, which had once been wide open to the sunlight, were now perpetually shut, the cracks between the boards barely wide enough to see through. One day, Silas vanished. There was no explanation, no goodbye. His house stood abandoned, his animals left to roam wild in the fields, but the barn remained. And that's when the true horror began. With Silas gone, no one dared touch the barn, though the barn itself seemed to hold a grip on anyone who came too close. Rumors spread that the barn had become a hiding place for unspeakable acts, illegal activities, even worse than the whispers had ever suggested. It was said that, in the dead of night, a group of men would come to the barn, men from out of town, never seen during the day, but unmistakable at night. They would enter the barn with grim faces and leave with hardened expressions, often dragging something, sometimes a horse, sometimes a man. The horses that had been bred in the barn were sold, but not to just anyone. They were sold to the highest bidder in the underground world of horse fighting. The barn had transformed into a cruel training ground, where horses were pushed to their limits, forced to fight one another in brutal, bloody bouts. The cries of animals echoed from the barn, too horrible to ignore, but too distant to save them. A few brave souls tried to confront the sinister activities. The town sheriff, at one point, gathered a group of men to go to the barn and investigate, but they never returned. Days later, a note was found nailed to the sheriff's office door: "Stay away from the barn. The darkness inside it is older than you can understand." With the sheriff's disappearance, the barn became even more shrouded in mystery, its presence casting a long, dark shadow over Hollow Creek. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone knew to avoid it. The town was slowly suffocating under the weight of its own fear, and yet no one had the courage to expose what was truly happening inside those rotting walls. As the years passed, the barn stood silent, its dark history buried beneath layers of neglect and time. But the land surrounding it never felt the same. Those who lived nearby claimed to see strange figures moving in the mist at night. Some said they heard horses whinnying in distress when the wind was just right. And others, those who were brave or foolish enough to get too close, felt a presence, something watching them from the shadows. By the time Jake Harrison came to town, the barn had become a ghost story, a place for people to point at from a distance but never approach. It was a place where no one dared venture, and no one wanted to remember. But Jake was different. He didn't believe in ghost stories or legends. And as he stood at the edge of the fog, staring at the barn, something inside him shifted. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the barn loomed like a dark sentinel, its weathered doors sealed shut with time. The questions that plagued the townspeople suddenly seemed like a puzzle to him, one he was determined to solve. Little did Jake know, the dark history of that barn wasn't finished with him yet. The secrets buried there were waiting to be unearthed, and they would stop at nothing to keep their hold on Hollow Creek. The sun had barely slipped beneath the horizon when Jake Harrison saddled up his horse, determined to put the town's rumors to rest. He had heard the stories, the chilling whispers, the tales of vanished animals, and the eerie sounds drifting from the barn. But Jake wasn't one to believe in ghosts or curses. What could a dilapidated barn possibly hide, after all? Only fools let fear govern their actions. Yet, as he rode toward the edge of town, where the barn loomed like a dark stain against the twilight sky, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling tightening in his chest. His horse, Dusty, was a steady mare, one Jake had known for years. But tonight, even she seemed uneasy, ears flicking back every few moments as if hearing something Jake couldn't. He urged her forward, the rhythm of their hooves steady on the gravel path, until the trees closed in and the barn came into full view. The barn was even worse than he had imagined. It stood in a clearing, its frame crooked, like a giant skeleton reaching toward the sky. A thick fog clung to the ground, swirling around the base of the barn like a living thing. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and decaying leaves, and Jake could hear the faintest sound of something scraping against the floor inside, like nails on a chalkboard. His hand tightened around the reins as he brought Dusty to a halt, just outside the barn's rotting wooden doors. The barn had been abandoned for years, but there was something about it, something that felt alive. The windows, dark and empty, seemed to watch him, and the heavy silence that hung in the air pressed down on his chest like a weight. But he pushed the feeling aside. This was nothing more than a collection of old stories, superstition and fear dressed up in the shape of a barn. Jake dismounted and approached the barn, his boots crunching on the gravel. As he neared the door, he noticed that it was slightly ajar, just enough for a person to slip through. The barn had always been sealed shut, according to the townspeople. A gust of wind pushed the door open just enough for Jake to slip inside. A cold rush of air hit him as he entered, carrying with it the sharp smell of hay and something else, something metallic like blood. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, then pulled out a lantern from his pack. The dim light flickered as he moved deeper into the barn. The vast space was shrouded in shadows, the beams of the old structure groaning under the weight of years. The ground was littered with debris, broken wooden planks, shards of glass, and crushed hay scattered in every direction. Jake's footsteps echoed through the barn, the silence pressing in from all sides. He scanned the area, looking for anything out of place. There was nothing unusual at first glance, just an old barn in ruins. But then, as he ventured deeper, he saw the first signs that not everything here was as it seemed. There, in the far corner of the barn, was a broken section of the floor where the boards had been splintered. He approached cautiously, setting the lantern on the ground to get a better look. As he peered through the hole, his heart skipped a beat. Beneath the barn was a hidden pit, its walls steeped in shadow. The air was thick with the smell of rot, and Jake could hear faint rustling sounds coming from below. Someone was down there. He knelt down, trying to peer into the darkness below. His fingers brushed against something cold and metallic, an old, rusted chain embedded into the floor. As his hand ran along the surface, he felt a sudden cold chill brush past him. It was as if the very air had shifted, a sense of dread wrapping itself around him. Before he could stand, the sound of hooves echoed through the barn. Jake froze, every muscle tensed. Dust's nervous whinny came from outside the barn, but the sound was strange, distorted, as though something was wrong. He turned swiftly, lantern raised high, and caught sight of movement in the far corner of the barn. A shadow moved across the far wall, shifting unnaturally. Jake's pulse quickened. Someone or something was inside the barn with him. He didn't wait to find out who or what it was. He grabbed his lantern and hurried toward the back of the barn, his boots clomping loudly against the wooden floor. His heart pounded in his chest, each step bringing him closer to whatever lay hidden in the shadows. The rustling noises grew louder, and Jake's breath came in short bursts. As he rounded the corner, he froze. There, in the dim light, he saw it, an old stall, once used for keeping horses, now long abandoned. But inside, a figure stood hunched over, its back turned to him. The figure was fiddling with something in the stall, but it didn't seem to notice Jake's presence. His grip tightened on the lantern, and with a deep breath, Jake took a cautious step forward. But just as he did, the figure straightened, and the unmistakable sound of a horse's whinny echoed through the barn, sharp, desperate, and filled with terror. Jake's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't a ghost. This wasn't superstition. There was something or someone trapped inside this barn. Something in need of help. He took a step forward, but his foot caught on a loose board, and the creaking noise pierced the air. The figure spun around, and Jake's blood ran cold. The face he saw was not human. It was pale and twisted, like something that had been shaped by the darkness itself. And in its eyes, Jake saw not just malice but hunger. The barn was not just a place of fear. It was a trap. And now, Jake was caught in it. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears as the figure before him moved with an eerie, unnatural grace. It wasn't human, not in any sense he recognized. The pale face was gaunt, eyes too wide, skin stretched too tightly, as if it had been hollowed out and then hastily put back together. But it wasn't the creature's appearance that sent a cold shiver down his spine. It was the sense of ancient evil that seemed to radiate from it, a presence that gnawed at the edges of his mind, urging him to flee. But Jake stood frozen, caught in its gaze. The creature's lips curled into a twisted smile, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. Its breath was ragged, like it had been starved for days, if not weeks. It stepped toward him slowly, deliberately, each movement causing the barn to groan in protest. The horse inside the stall let out a desperate, frantic whinny, its distress echoing through the barn. The creature glanced over its shoulder at the animal, then back at Jake, as if deciding which threat to deal with first. Jake's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet remained planted. The lantern trembled in his hand as he gripped it tighter. His mind raced for an explanation, any reason why this creature, this thing, should be here in the barn. But there was none. The history of the barn had always been about ghosts and rumors, things that couldn't be explained until now. This thing, this abomination, wasn't born from superstition. It was something real, something far more sinister than a mere ghost. Suddenly, the creature spoke, its voice raspy and guttural, as though it had not used words in a long time. "You shouldn't have come here, Cowboy," it rasped, each word dripping with malice. "No one leaves this place once they've heard the truth." Jake's breath hitched as realization crashed over him like a wave. The barn, the rumors, the disappearances, it was all connected. But not to ghosts or curses. The barn had become a breeding ground for something darker, far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The creature before him wasn't just a figure of nightmare, it was part of the twisted legacy of the barn itself. The horse's frantic whinnies grew louder as the creature approached, but Jake didn't take his eyes off it. The puzzle pieces clicked together in his mind. This creature, this thing, was a result of the barn's brutal history. It was no simple haunting, no residual spirit. It was a product of the evil that had taken root here, bred from the twisted acts that had once taken place within these walls. The barn had been a place where dark forces had gathered, where the innocent had been torn apart, and in return, something vile had been born. The realization struck Jake hard. The barn didn't just house animals or humans, it housed the twisted remnants of a nightmare. And now, that nightmare was alive, a grotesque entity that had been allowed to fester and grow in the darkness. The creature lurched forward with unnatural speed, but Jake acted on pure instinct. With a yell, he swung the lantern, catching it in midair and sending a shower of sparks into the creature's face. The thing recoiled, its eyes burning with fury. But Jake didn't wait to see what happened next. With the creature momentarily distracted, he grabbed the terrified horse by the reins and dragged it toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no time to waste. If he didn't escape now, he would never leave this barn alive. As he reached the door, he glanced back one last time. The creature stood in the shadows, watching him, its eyes burning with hatred. Jake knew then that whatever evil had taken root here would never truly be gone. The barn was still alive with darkness, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to walk through its rotting doors. Jake didn't look back again. He slammed the barn door shut behind him, the sound of the creature's growl echoing in the still night air. He had escaped, but the revelation had come too late. The barn's curse was real, and now he was forever marked by it. Jake's heart hammered in his chest as the creature lunged, its twisted form surging toward him. With no time to think, he swung the lantern with all his strength, catching the creature's face in a flash of blinding light. It hissed in agony, stumbling back, giving Jake a split second to act. He grabbed the horse's reins, pulling it toward the door, the creature's growls reverberating in his bones. The barn seemed to close in around him, but Jake didn't stop. He ran, dragging the terrified horse into the night. Behind him, the barn stood silent, but the darkness was far from finished. Jake didn't look back as he rode away. The image of the barn still burned in his mind. The horse, once terrified, was now calm in his arms, its wide eyes still flickering with the fear of what it had endured. He knew the barn's dark history could never be erased, but he had exposed a truth far worse than any ghost story. The creature's eyes haunted him, a reminder that some evil never truly dies, it just waits for the next victim. Jake rode on into the night, knowing one thing for certain: Hollow Creek would never be the same.